everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Mike Crowley. Mike Crowley is the author of The Secret Drugs of Buddhism, which I think is a long overdue book to be discussed on the show, and really excited that Synergetic Press got us in touch. Mike is a longtime Buddhist practitioner, psychonaut, and initiate into certain forms of Buddhism. So this is a really interesting, broad-ranging interview. I think you're going to like it. Side note, there might be a little bit of a low-quality situation going with the audio. It's not that bad, but wanted to give you kind of a heads up just in case you were curious if it was your phone or not. No, it's us. So don't worry about it. And sorry. And we'll try to make it better in the future. So before we let you hear the interview, just wanted to give you a quick heads up about what's going on over here. If you want to support us, maybe tell some therapist or nurse friends about navigating psychedelics for clinicians and therapists. Just got a really nice review from a past student, and wanted to point it out. The class starts in September. You can learn more at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. If you want to dig in, and feel free to always ask us questions at psychedelicstoday, email@gmail.com. But yeah, here's a review from our student, Jessica. Jessica states, Psychedelics Today is a doorway into a welcoming community. I started by listening to their podcasts and recently completed their integration course for therapists and clinicians. It was packed full of information and included insightful conversations with like-minded individuals. Kyle and Joe have an incredible depth of knowledge that is evident in any conversation around altered states of consciousness. A fantastic resource. I highly recommend following these guys. So that's a quick testimonial from a recent student. And we've got a number of other testimonials up there at psychedeliceducationcenter.com where you can learn more. So I hope you all enjoy this episode and share it with a friend if you like it. See you on the other side. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today we have Mike Crowley, author of Secret Drugs of Buddhism. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. But if you don't mind me nitpicking already,
You got it.
The name is Crowley, the Irish version, not like Alistair. He was a Crowley, which is a completely different English name with the same spelling.
All right. Thank you for that. It's always an interesting division. I didn't know there was the Irish version. Good.
Oh, it's far, far more common than Crowley. Crowley is a very rare name. It's named after an English village in Cheshire. Crowley is, we're all descendants of the same person. Crowley MacDermot in Gaelic, Dermot in English, and he was a bit of a bastard. He raised an army to expel the Saxons from Ireland and never got rid of it. Existed as a warlord for a bit. So if you go to West Cork in Ireland, you find half the people there are called Mike Crowley. The other half are called Mary Crowley. And nevertheless, everyone, you're not unusual. Everyone calls me Crowley until I set them right, like the irritating pedant that I am.
We'll get it in the intro, so nobody will be confused.
Okay.
All right. So this book is really interesting, and it is timely, too, because of this whole new psychedelic, I don't even know about new, expanding psychedelic wave of awareness, I guess, about these drugs. And an expanding popularity of Buddhism, too. And my exposure to a lot of Buddhists has been that it's largely a sober community. No real interest in getting stoned. Or if they do, it's kind of shameful. And then there's also these like secret areas in Buddhism where, oh, my teacher told me this, but I can't tell you. It's like, good Lord. So it hits all of these points, your book. And that's kind of one of the things that made me really excited about it. So maybe, can you give us just a little bit of background on you and how you got interested in Buddhism before we start moving towards the book?
Sure. Well, I do explain this in the book. My interest in Buddhism came about in a peculiar way. I was at school. I was I was 15. And I was quite politically active at the time, especially in the anti-war movement. I was anti-nuclear and an activist in the anti-nuclear weapons campaigns of the 1960s. I was extremely left-wing, and there was a week of talks, workshops, and discussions at a neighboring school. And information about it was posted on a notice board in my school, and I looked it over, and there were scheduled lectures in the morning of every day of the week, then workshops and discussions in the afternoon. I looked them over. They were all great. They were all about the apartheid system in South Africa and the threat of nuclear weapons and anti-colonialism all over the British Empire and things like this. Yes, I would go to any. Oh, Tuesday doesn't seem to have anything interesting at all. Absolutely nothing. I hope I get one of the other days. Well, I didn't. I got the Tuesday. And so I thought, I sat through the lectures in the morning. One of them was some perfectly intelligent person who seems to have fallen prey to some ridiculous Oriental god cult. I think I'll go to his workshop and just be a pain in the ass. I'll have fun by making impertinent remarks and asking awkward questions, as I usually did to entertain myself. And so the guy astonished me. Not only was he an atheist, he didn't even believe in the soul. And I had to stop and think about that one. Anyway, every single statement he made, I challenged. I wanted the answer to this. And this earned me black looks from all the girls who'd gone to the class. And after the talk, I went up to him and said, "That was amazing. Where can I find out more about this stuff?" And it was his turn to be astonished. He said, "Oh, I thought you were dead set against everything I had to say." And I said, "No, I just asked questions, and you gave the right answers to all of them." And so he was quite taken aback by this. Gave me the address of the British Buddhist Association, 58 Eccleston Square in London, in Belgravia. And so for the next few years, whenever I went from Cardiff to London, or whatever, business, school, whatever, I always popped into 58 Eccleston Square and picked up some pamphlets or bought a book or two. And eventually, when I left Cardiff and moved up to London, I was able to attend more regular lectures. In fact, initially I was most interested in Zen and attended the lectures of Irmgard Schlögl. I was very, very taken with Zen. Then something strange happened. I had a neighbor who was an avid attendee of jumble sales. Now, in the States, I think you'd call these rummage sales. Mm-hmm. But he would hit about 6 every Saturday morning and just snatch up whatever was valuable and bring it home. And first of all, he would call in on his friend, my landlord, and show what he'd managed to acquire that week. And we got some amazing stuff. My girlfriend got a very good Russian sable coat. He bought it for a few pennies. We had it repaired for a couple of pounds, and it ended up worth hundreds. He also had an incredible, huge Nepalese temple lamp that he'd found at some church sale. Incredible museum quality stuff. Anyway, one day he comes along with this 4-inch long brass object which has a pointed end at one end and a horse's head at the other. And the point has got three sides to it. And in the middle, there is what turns out to be a Vajra, a thunderbolt. I was completely baffled by this, but I'd seen one in a book which I'd borrowed from the British Buddhist Society library. And the guy says to me, "What do you think this is?" I only bought it because it's weird. And I said, "Oh, I don't know exactly what it is, but there's a picture of one in a book." First of all, he said, "I think it's Mexican." And I said, "No, it's Tibetan. I got a picture in the book." I ran upstairs, got the book, showed him the picture. He said, "Oh, you can keep it then, if you are interested in these things." And I said, "Oh, well, I can possibly. It's probably valuable." And he said, "No, it cost me twopence. That's 2 pence. And probably like a nickel in US money." So I gladly accepted it from him, but now I had to find out what it was. And I took it to the Buddhist Society next time I went up to London. And I was living on the outskirts of London, you understand, at this time, so it was about an hour's journey in. And the librarian there, an amazing woman called Pat Wilkinson, who had hitchhiked to Southeast Asia in the 20s so that she could study Buddhism, became a nun. Amazing, amazing woman. Anyway, she said, "No, you've read both our books on Tibetan Buddhism, but there is this Tibetan monk who's just arrived in London." And she set up a meeting with him. I met him, discovered he wasn't just a monk. He was a reincarnate lama who became friends with. I used to visit him once a week. After about 4 years of this, I asked if I could study under him, and he instantly changed. He went from being friend to being teacher, like a completely different personality. And he ordained me after several tests that he told me later he was testing me. I didn't know at the time. But he ordained me as a layman and upasaka. In Tibetan, it's Genyen. Gave me the five vows called Panchasila or Pansil. And let me say, it was 1970, I think it was 27 years after I was ordained as a lama. No, it was 21 years since I started studying with him. I was ordained as a lama and acquired a large library of Tibetan books and books on Buddhism and so on. And it was reading these that I kept accumulating these clues that there was psychedelic use. Besides which, there's a very definite and not hidden at all use of a drink called Amrita. Now, for those who think I'm saying Amanita, I'm not. Amrita means deathless in Sanskrit. The Tibetan is Dutsi, which means demon juice. But I won't go into that now. Almost all Vajrayana ceremonies, that is Tantric Buddhist ceremonies, begin with taking this liquid. If you read the ancient texts about this liquid, it's quite obviously a psychedelic. And the very first mention of something called Amrita is the Rig Veda, in which it is a synonym for soma, the sacred drug of the Vedic Brahmins. Soma, by the way, just means juice. It means that which is pressed out, which we can summarize in English as juice. So, yes, I frequently encounter this attitude that real Buddhists don't take drugs. Well, there's been this Amrita thing for, about 1,800 years now. That's been going on in Vajrayana. I admit that if you restrict yourselves to Southern Buddhism, like the Buddhism of Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, you don't meet with Amrita. But in the north, in Nepal, Tibet, Mongolia, and even as far afield as Japan, we have Vajrayana Buddhism, which really the Amrita seems central to. Part of the problem here is that the use of Amrita is shrouded in secrecy. I know far more than I have put into the book because there's stuff that I've learned under vows of secrecy in initiation ceremonies. If any of your listeners have had the initiation into the body mandala of Chakrasambhara in the tradition of Luipa, I would love to talk to them because there's things that I should share with them that I can't talk about with anyone else. So, yes, it is kind of paradoxical that there is part of Buddhism is saying, no, we don't use drugs. But real Buddhists don't use drugs. And there's this other part which, although they incorporate that part of Buddhism into their system, there is also part of their system which does use drugs. In fact, the use of drugs in religion, we can say, dates back to Vedic Hinduism, but it did crop up in medieval Buddhism to such an extent that there was even a drug-using, a psychedelic-using branch of Theravada. The southern Buddhist vehicle is what the Buddhists say. Yana means vehicle, like a wagon or something. And yes, these psychedelic using Theravadins were known as Vaidzya, which actually comes from the Sanskrit word vidya, which means literally vision, and it's cognate with our word video. But these Vaidsyas still exist, but strangely they've lost the Buddhist part of their practice, and they now exist as shamans in Burma and northern Thailand. I would love to investigate them and go on an expedition to these places sometime and find out what their tradition actually consists of. But I've only so far read about them in books.
So medieval Buddhism, I'm not too familiar. Is it similar period to Europe or same time frame is what you're referring to?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I am.
Okay.
In India, we can say there was a period before the Vedas and where you had quite high civilization of the Indus Valley civilization. We have only known about them for roughly 100 years. It seems to be a very advanced, extensive civilization that traded with Sumeria and neighboring cultures. They had a writing system which we don't understand. They had straight streets, houses of regular shape and size, running water. They had possibly flushing toilets. They did have municipal sewers. Yeah, this was all like 4000 BC. So one thing that's never been found is two things actually: a temple or a palace. They've never found either of those. But on the seals, there are some strange, often not on all seals, but a good number of them. There's a strange object which looks like a kind of a brazier or something, and it seems to be a sieve because sometimes there are drops of liquids coming under it. It's known as the cult object. There is an Indian professor who studied over 1,000 seals with these cult objects on them, and he's come to the conclusion that it's a sieve for a drug. The most likely candidate for a drug around there would be psilocybin, as Psilocybe cubensis grows extensively on cattle dung or through it actually, and they were cattle herders. So they probably knew about it. They died out through agricultural disaster. The sea level was rising. And later, a few hundred years after they disappeared, the Indo-Europeans arrived in the form of the 5 Aryan tribes. And this is not Hitler's Aryan, by the way. He borrowed the term and misused it. But these were the people who had the Rig Veda. They spoke Sanskrit. In fact, Sanskrit was a kind of lingua franca they made up from the languages of the 5 tribes. And they took all the irregular bits out of it. And so it was a concocted language. Its name, Sanskrit, means the perfected one. But in a religion, they took a drug. In fact, your average Aryan didn't have a religion. Religion was something you paid a caste of priests to do. And they performed rituals. Their most important ritual was called the Ashvamedha, which involved setting one of the king's horses free for a year to wander around. And it wasn't allowed to have sex for a year. And then eventually it was, after a year and a day, it was smothered with a pillow and killed. And the king's favorite wife then has to mime sex with it under a blanket, and they killed the horse and ate it. That's a little sample of how amazingly weird these people were. So one very, very important ritual that they had, that they wrote, or I should say they composed the Rig Veda about this ritual. Of course, this was composed before there was writing, so it was just memorized. The Rig Veda are the verses which are recited when performing a fire sacrifice. An animal was sacrificed, a fire was lit in a special hearth made of 108 bricks in the shape of an eagle. And during the ritual, a plant or a growing thing was ground between 2 stones, the sun and moon stones they're called, and milk or water was added to make a liquid which there was caught on a leather cowhide and gathered up, filtered through sheep's wool. A little of it was offered to the gods on the fire, and the rest of it was drunk by the priests. And the whole thing ended up in a freestyle rapping contest. I'm serious about that. So it seems that the hymns are, by the way, the chapters of the book are called mandalas. This is an early use of the word mandala. And the hymns themselves are called mantras, which again is a different use of the word mantra, and it's the earliest use that we know. But they are said to have originated as the freestyle rapping of a group of priests called the rishis. These are ancient wise ones who seem to have miraculous powers. One of the metaphors for this drug that they made and consumed was Amrita. Well, fast forward 1,000 years, the Vedas die out. The practice of the Vedas, the Vedic rituals, doesn't seem to be as important in the years, say, around 500 BC. But new religions start coming up then. For instance, the Ajivakas, the very interesting one, they no longer exist. The Jains, also very interesting, an extreme pacifist sect. You can never get threatened by extremist Jains. They'll take extreme care not to harm anything. And Buddhists.
They're the slow walking ones that don't want to step on ants, all that kind of thing.
That's it, yes. And they even have a 3-legged stool that they sit on, and they sharpen the legs. Every time they sit down, they sharpen them into points because they don't want it to compress the molecules of the earth in case those molecules are sentient. But I always think about, what about those 3 molecules directly beneath the points? They must be suffering like fuck. Okay. Yes, Buddhism came about at the same time. strange thing is that the founder of Jainism and the founder of Buddhism appear to have identical biographies. The names are changed, but the stories almost identical. Also in the Jain histories, the Varakaman, or that was his regular name, he became known as Mahavira, the great hero. He had a student called Siddhartha, which makes you scratch your head. Anyway, Buddhism in its original form prospered in across Asia until there was a movement to expand the religion beyond monks and nuns, which was the original practitioners were only monks and nuns, and to expand some of the philosophy as well. Whereas early Buddhism said that there is no soul that makes a man what he is or she is, if it's a woman. The new movement said there's nothing in anything that makes it what it is. That nothing has an intrinsic quality which provides its essence to it. There's nothing in a tree which makes it a tree, or there's nothing in a chair that makes it a chair. Take the chair apart, you won't find any chairness in it. So this new system, which relied on the utter no-thingness of reality, was called Mahayana, the great vehicle. And they referred to the older Buddhism as Hinayana, which means the lesser vehicle. And the idea of a bodhisattva came about too, somebody who puts everyone else, all sentient beings, before himself. Somebody who is entirely generous and self-sacrificing was known as a bodhisattva. And this became the ideal. Part of this new Mahayana was the reverence of certain famous bodhisattvas like Avalokiteshvara and Tara and Maitreya and Manjushri and so on. After a few more 100 years, something happened. It might have been the invasion of India by the Scythians, who in Sanskrit were called the Saka. And I only say this because the dates seem to coincide with all Indian religions getting tantric. Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, they all developed tantric forms at this point. And this is where Amrita becomes very central to these tantric sects of Buddhism. Initially, the practitioners...
And how do we want to understand that word, Mike, tantric? I hear it as kind of more participatory, like maybe Gnostic-ish, but how do you use it?
Oh, that's true. Well, looking at it etymologically, we can see it as a development from the sutras. Sutra literally means thread because they were written on palm leaves that were connected by string. The pages were separate, held together with a hole in the end of the page with a string through it. So sutra means a thread. Tantra means weave or weft. And if a sutra is one-dimensional, Tantra is two-dimensional. So there's that. Tantra is, by the way, so I should explain, these are texts. Tantras are texts. Sutras are texts. The basic Buddhism had sutras that started, "Thus have I heard. At one time, the Buddha was dwelling in location in the company of list of people who were there with him. And he was asked this question by this person." Okay, that sets up the discourse of the Buddha, which is basically a kind of Socratic dialogue. Buddha mainly asking skillfully directed questions. Mm-hmm. So with the Mahayana, we get this like greatly elaborated version of a sutra, because we've now got all these enlightened beings, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, mahabodhisattvas, and so on. And it says, "Thus did I hear at one time, when the Buddha was dwelling in this mythical Buddha land, it will be named like Sukhavati or somewhere, Abhirati, these various Buddha lands, or it could be on top of an unscalable mountain, where, various mythologized details, in the company of these, and there are these horrendously long lists of bodhisattvas and mahasattvas and deities and cosmic beings and visitors from other planes, other planets, and God, it goes on forever. And then he was asked this question by this person, etc. Now, those are the sutras. The tantras, on the other hand, start, "Thus did I hear at one time, when the Buddha," and there's the name of a Buddha, typically what you might call a meditation Buddha or a philosophical Buddha. They're not even thought of having real existence. They're more of a concept of Buddhahood. Okay, when such and such a Buddha was dwelling in, and here we come to a crucial tantric point, was dwelling in the vagina of such and such a goddess, in the company of these gods, deities, like bodhisattvas, demons, whatever. I think a lot of this was intended to just make Orthodox Buddhists recoil in horror and slap the book shut. These are not to be taken in any way literally. An important point about the Tantras is that they were written in code. The code is called Santyabhasa, and you are instructed in it at the end of initiations. They will tell you will be initiated into a deity. That deity is Tantra, and you'll be given permission to read and study that Tantra, and the symbols will be explained to you. So that's the main initiation is in Tibetan is called the Wang. The permission to read and study and practice is called the Lung, and the explanation of symbols is called the Tree. So not all initiations have them. The good ones have all three, but many only have the first part of that three.
So weave sounds like a great word for it. It seems very appropriate. It's kind of like a system is maybe an analogy I would use.
Yeah, and another point is that in the tree, you may be told what order to read the Tantra into, because very often the pages are shuffled and deliberately to confuse anyone who stumbles across it without the appropriate initiations. But before you have an initiation, you're given Amrita to drink. And before pretty much any important Vajrayana ceremony, you're given Amrita to drink. You asked, though, what do I understand by the term Tantra, Tantric? And in Buddhism, it is the commitment to maintain awareness at all times. And this awareness is a technical term. It's not exactly the way we would use it, and it's more like focused, non-dual awareness. Awareness without being conscious of self or other, just aware of sense impressions, if you like. But we are enjoined to maintain this high state of awareness at all times. In fact, one of the vows I've had as part of a quite high Vajrayana initiation is that I must take some kind of Amrita every day. I told Jim Fadiman about this ancient Tibetan microdosing, and he was quite tickled to bits. I mean, he was, but but I am supposed to take some form of amrita every day, even, it says, even if it's only alcohol.
It's fascinating. So it's such a broad term.
Yes, it's basically any psychoactive. But then we must contrast the Tibetan use of the Buddhist use of amrita, and also the Burn also use amrita, but a lot of modern Bumpo religion is just a copy of Buddhism. But I won't go into that now. What we must distinguish this Tibetan use of amrita from, there is something called chulen. There is a different Tibetan use of psychoactive plants, which is not part of the amrita tradition, and it is said to be the Tibetan version of Indian alchemy or rasayana. Rasayana is the vehicle of taste, according to the translation. I mean, that's how it translates, the taste vehicle. And many people, like when I published the first edition, wrote to me saying, but you didn't say anything about chulen. So there's an appendix in the second edition which talks about chulen and some of the plants of chulen, which I have to admit I've not taken any of them. Oh, shilajit. I have taken shilajit, which is basically bitumen. But there are things like the plant, the roots of Codonopsis ovata or other Codonopsis species. Something known as ludu doje, which I don't know what that is. Haven't been able to find it. There's something called Dakini's radish, which is not a radish. It's actually like a 6 to 7 foot Himalayan rhubarb, but it's psychoactive. So there's a lot of stuff there that, and psychoactive honey from the Himalayas too.
Have you tried that? I heard it was not exactly desirable.
I haven't, because I studied Greek in high school and remember the Anabasis by Thucydides, when he is like trying to get out of the Persian world. He is like trying to escape from Persia with his troops, and they've run for 3 days and they're starving, and they come across beehives and in the land of Pontus, and they consume these and pass out for 3 days, and they come around, they go, oh, blimey, we were lucky. We could have been killed in our sleep. Anyway, that stuff is still called Pontic honey because of that. Because there's the early spring honey in the ancient land of Pontus, south of the Black Sea, was considered to be what was strong in gyanotoxins, which are the alkaloid responsible for this psychoactivity. It's not very fun. As far as I can see, it induces tunnel vision and unconsciousness, and if you eat enough of it, death. The Gurung people of Nepal collect it for medicinal purposes, and they will touch some of the honey on the palm of their hand to see if it makes their hand tingle, to know whether it's the good stuff.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's one of the several drugs that I've read about and said, no, I don't think so.
Yeah, there's plenty out there. Like, I'm very drug curious, but it just never really seemed to sell. They say it's psychedelic, and it just looks like no. Not. Doesn't really look that way.
I know that there's a Vice video which says it's psychedelic, but it bloody isn't. No, there's other things I won't even experiment with are datura and henbane and those tropane alkaloids. I've heard too many horror stories about those.
It's interesting though, right? Like those are kind of culturally in our background, like genetically speaking, like in the witchcraft and all that we're inheriting.
Yes, I would defer all comment on that to Tom Hatzis. He is the expert on medieval European witchcraft and their drugs. He is a very, very interesting chap on the subject. He suggests that a lot of the drugs were to be given by women to abusive husbands, and maybe they'd mix them in their food or something. And while the drug is beginning to take effect, the woman would be given something by the witch, whoever, to recite as if it's a spell. And when the husband is paralyzed, the wife will tell him, "See, I did that to you with the spell. Now, mend your ways or I'll do it to you again."
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's a great publisher in England right now called Scarlet Imprint who kind of carries that tradition a bit.
Oh.
And they've been able to find some really interesting folks in far Eastern Europe who claim to still carry the same tradition that's been around for many hundreds of years, which is curious. I'd like to know more. Just need more time, I guess.
Yeah, I've spent some time in Eastern Europe, and I taught on behalf of my teacher in Poland, and they pointed out places. My students pointed out places where witches used to gather as late as the 1930s, and I was pointed out a hill. And I was told, covens used to meet there in the 30s and dance naked in the moonlight. And that was all stamped out by the Nazis, of course, they said. And didn't nobody survived and nobody did. Well, not as far as we know. So, yes, there does seem to be some very tantalizing records from Eastern Europe. Also from Afghanistan, where Amanita muscaria use seems to continue.
And didn't you say that the Buddhism was pretty strong in Afghanistan for a long time at one point?
Well, I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
I think I've heard you say on other interviews that Buddhism had quite the foothold in Afghanistan as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially demotically. It was never part of the Persian king's spiritual practice. They were Zoroastrians, and the aristocracy was Zoroastrian. But really, as far west as the Persian Gulf, you will even find Buddhist place names in Saudi Arabia along the coast. That shows how far Buddhism spread. Of course, there was a Buddhist kingdom in what we now call Afghanistan for about 700 years. They were the kings of that area were remnants of Alexander's army. One of his kings, called Melandros, became king of Bactria, which acquired the name of Gandhara, which means the perfumed place. It's now become corrupted to Kandahar. And the king, Melandros, his name is preserved in Buddhist literature as Milinda. And there is a Pali text called the Milinda Panha, which means the questions of King Melandros. And he was visited by a Buddhist monk called Nagasena. And he asked Nagasena a whole bunch of questions about Buddhism, and these were recorded. At the end of it, he says, well, those were pretty sensible answers. I'm quite impressed. I think I'll become a Buddhist. So he did. So this country, Gandhara, became officially Buddhist. They spoke Greek. They wore Greek clothes, lived in Afghanistan, produced coins that had Buddha on it, and it said Bodo in Greek. And what I think is really, really cute, on the other side of the coin, there's Hercules.
That's fascinating. Wow.
So all of the statues we see of the Buddha are basically based on the statues made in this kingdom of Gandhara. And they wear Greek clothes. They wear Greek clothes, but originally had their hair tied up in a bun on top of their head, like a modern man bun. But this was actually the Central Asian Scythian style of wearing your hair, which presumably they did in Gandhara as well. This was unknown in India. People didn't tie their hair up on the top of their head. And so when they saw these Gandharan statues, they made imitation statues with just a bump on the top of their head. Mm. This bump became known as the Ushnisha, which is derived from the word turban. And when we come to later, like Vajrayana period, there is a group of deities, Buddhist Buddhas, which have Ushnisha in their name. And they seem to have absolutely nothing to do with the bump on the Buddha's head. There was a book published in 1956 by a guy called Binoy Bhattacharya called Buddhist Iconography. And he has a whole chapter on these Ushnisha deities. And he says, I freely admit I have no idea what these were about, but I'm including them for completion only, for completeness only, because they seem to have been important some hundreds of years ago. Well, I had a look at them and their names, and it seemed to me that this was a bit of tantric double talk. There are, obviously several layers of meaning in tantric works, and I think this Ushnisha refers to a bump on the top of some mushrooms, specifically psilocybin mushrooms. Psilocybe is a genus which is one of its characteristic features is the umbo on the pileus, a bump on the cap of the mushroom. And so if you look at the names of these Ushnisha deities, they are things like sprouting Ushnisha, scattered Ushnisha, vomit Ushnisha, anointed with vomit Ushnisha. Now, admittedly, some of these terms are like double meanings, but when you consider them in terms of mushrooms, their appearance and their effects, I mean, one is like spicy Ushnisha, for God's sake. They're obviously talking about mushrooms, which are different varieties, have different effects, and there is a Japanese list in which we're told the color of various of these Ushnisha deities. Well, in tantric texts, they often tell you that the colors, the tantric colors are usually black, blue, white, yellow, red, and green, and combinations thereof. These Japanese Ushnisha deities are white, off-white, slightly yellowish white, and they're more like the colors that you will see in a mushroom field guide than you will see in tantric scriptures. So that is a hypothesis of mine, which I've written it up and it's been published in a peer-reviewed journal. So it is out there. I haven't had it contradicted yet, as nobody else can think up any other reason why these Buddhas exist. But there you go. I think a lot of my work is validated by the fact that I can explain certain things that haven't been explained otherwise.
So another really interesting thing I've heard you mention before is that there's this kind of tradition of pills, magical pills. Can you speak to that?
Oh, yes. Tutsi Robo, yeah. Carry on.
I just wondering if you can speak about those a bit.
Well, yes, there are various kinds of pills. There are the Dutsirubu or Amrita pills. And they are just a concentrated solid form of Amrita, which has to be diluted in order to be consumed. There are other pills, though. The Gutika is a word for a pill, and you see like certain statuettes, really little shrine statues of famous teachers, like holding a pill, and it looks like a ball of hashish or something, but it's substantial size. It's something you'd have to cut it into a few pieces in order to get it down, or dissolve it in liquid. These are called Gutika. Then there's the Buchara Siddhi. The various siddhis are, if you put it into modern words, there's superpowers. Mm-hmm. The ability to fly, to walk through walls, and to shrink to a tiny size or expand to vast size. And to me, they're all things that apply to mushrooms and other psychedelic drugs. But Buchara Siddhi is literally the ability to make pills. And a lot of the writings about the siddhis seem to talk about various drugs as well. So, yes, I view all writings about the siddhis with great interest and suspicion.
Yeah, I was certainly very curious about it when I was reading about that stuff in my undergrad, but it was also really interesting. It's like these things exist, but they're to be avoided and not seeked. It's just like...
Yeah, sometimes they say that. And then I didn't mention that there are some kinds of pills which seem to have no psychoactive activity at all, but are magic nonetheless. And I list the ingredients in one such pill in one of my appendices, and I think it goes on for 5 pages. Mm-hmm. With the a fragment of so and so's robe and the dust from someone's footprints and these kind of things. But then again, there are cities. There are city pills that do have an effect. The first Tibetan teacher in this country, Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, he lived in England first, and he lived before he came to the States, I guess. I knew him in England, and I knew people who lived with him in a hippie commune. And they said that he took LSD with them, but he criticized them for not giving it sufficient respect. He said that this is a powerful drug and you're just like treating it as a way to have fun. That's, it's much more important than that. Besides, in Tibet, we have such things, but they're more powerful than this. And they're called Dutsi Rilbu. That is Amrita pills, what you asked about. So when he was going to leave for the United States, he told my teacher, they were childhood friends and hung out a lot. He told my teacher told me, he said, Trungpa tells me that when he goes to America, he's going to teach the Vajrayana, but there's one element he's going to leave out because he knows that Westerners will abuse it. Well, I was pretty positive that what he was leaving out was the psychedelic part. In fact, years later, my own teacher said to me, I hear that you take drugs. Is this true? And I said, yes. And he said, I know why. It's because you're very smart. I never really understood that, but I think he'd figured out that I had worked out that psychedelics were part of Vajrayana Buddhism.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating. So there is this secret tradition, obviously secret drugs of Buddhism, that's been going on for a long time, had many iterations, rises and falls, it seems like. And here we are today on this psychedelic explosion. From what I've heard, more people are using drugs today than they were in the heyday of the 60s, psychedelic drugs in particular.
It does seem like it, yes. One thing I did start to say, and I distracted myself. When the Vajrayana started, the teachers were not necessarily Buddhist. The seminal figures of Buddhism are the 84 Mahasiddhas. There is a famous book of short biographies of these teachers called, it's by Abhayadatta, and it's called the 84 Mahasiddhas, and there are various different translations of it. The earliest Mahasiddhas, the most important ones in the book, are people like Luipa and Jalandharipa. So in the Nat tradition of Hindu Tantra, they have the same teachers, except they don't call them Mahasiddhas, they call them Nat, Lord, Nata, Lord. And they have one called Matsyendranath, which means fish Indra Lord. He is the same guy as Luipa. We know he's the same guy because we have the same stories about Luipa as the Hindus have about Matsyendranath. What happens is that he overhears Shiva teaching advanced philosophical concepts to his consort Uma, and overhearing this is enough to enlighten him. Well, this is in the Buddhist version too. And strangely, they haven't even changed the name of the god. It's still Shiva teaching Uma. So it seems that the early practitioners of Vajrayana didn't care whether you called them Hindu or Buddhist. Basically, they were just like giving people the Amrita and saying, do this meditation. And that was enough. People would get enlightened. So shortly after this period of explosion of Vajrayana in quite demotic terms, this was something of the people, it reached the establishment. By the 7th century, we know that the Vajrayana was being taught at the great Buddhist university, the monastic university of Nalanda. And I can imagine there were thousands of monks at Nalanda. You couldn't be giving all of them psychedelics at the same time. It would be chaos. After all, they would say, where do you get off getting so holy and high and mighty? I'm just as good as you. That would happen like 50 times a day if you started giving all these monks psychedelics. So I think that's the point where Amrita started getting substituted, such that it was just colored water with lots of blessings. Of course, that there are still Tibetan writings that I've found up until the 14th century, which speak of Amrita as being, a powerful substance which will actually even give you physical effects, like a burning sensation in the stomach after you've consumed it. This is written about in the 14th century, and even later in what's called the Dharma literature, the discovered texts, the treasure texts. Amrita is not only discussed, but some of these caches of texts actually had jars of Amrita pills with them. So this is a subject that is the topic of Amrita is well known in Vajrayana countries. Like, this is well known to be part of Buddhism. It's strange that some people have latched onto the "we won't do drugs" kind of Buddhism. But I say, what's so special about meditation? You can meditate for years, or you can have this pill. They both take you to the same place. Why is meditation preferred to the pill? Well, one reason is that it's endogenous. You don't need to take anything external. But the pill has the advantage of actually taking there and saying, see, this is how it is. Now you can go back and meditate and have that as your goal. Otherwise, you don't know what the hell you're doing. So they both have their drawbacks. They both have their good points. I think possibly a good idea to use them both. Daily meditation practice, very occasional psychedelic practice.
Right. If you're going after those goals. Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. There's been a gentleman that's reached out to me a number of times claiming, oh man, this is like probably your dream to debate this guy. It's just like nothing. He pretty much is saying everything that you've written is made up. And I'm like, I don't really understand how that could even be true. Everything you say seems very rational.
Every single assertion I make is backed up with an end note and bibliography. Sure, I made it up. I made up all those bibliographies, all those quotes. Yeah. So I really don't see how he can support such a.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure I would like to debate him because it sounds as though I'd get exasperated very soon.
Yeah, one of those folks that just walks you in circles for about 9 hours and you get nowhere. Perhaps. Yeah. I haven't chatted with this person yet, but I might try to talk to them to see, what semi-reasonable evidence they might have. But it makes sense that somebody would be out there trying to defend their religion and point of view to some sort of extreme. Yeah.
Yep, even some of the Buddhist texts themselves pour scorn on people who claim to be Buddhists. So it's some kind of supporting a football team, like, or it's like you wear your Buddhist T-shirt to show you're a Buddhist, but in the highest viewpoint of Buddhism is that categories don't exist. You might call yourself a Buddhist, but it's not a real category. Nothing is a real category, according to the view of no-thingness.
Buckminster Fuller, boundaries are useful illusions.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a big fan of Buckminster Fuller. Dogen, the founder of one of the branches of Zen Buddhism, basically introduced Zen to Japan, went to China to study at a monastery, and he was reviled because he was an ignorant barbarian from the outposts of Japan and put to work in the kitchen. Fortunately, the most enlightened man in the kitchen was the cook. And he had great conversations with the cook and wrote them down, which is a really interesting part of it. And the cook is going on about there being no categories. And Dogen says, what about the category of Buddhist? The monastery is filled with people who assure you that they are Buddhists. Is that category also illusory? And the cook says, of course it is. Well, don't pay any attention to them. They're a bunch of shaven-headed monkeys.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, there's always, in Buddhism, you'll find this irreverence for tradition. There is another story of a Zen monk who went to the Chinese emperor, and the Chinese emperor said to him, I've had all these sutras copied. What do you think of that? And he says, a bunch of skin and bones. He said, what are you talking about? What do you mean skin and bones? He says, well, once upon a time, there was a lot of meat on these sutras, but they've been picked over and analyzed, and by now, they're just a bunch of skin and bones. No meat left on them at all.
That's really interesting. Wow.
Yeah, and so I like to think that I belong to this kind of irreverent kind of Buddhism that has little patience for fanciful elaboration and most supposedly spiritual activities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So on the show, once in a while, I will critique Buddhism here and there. It needs a lot of critique, generally speaking, as most things do with where people are involved. And the critique,
everything up. If it wasn't people, it would be great.
So the critique generally is something along the lines of Buddhism not necessarily being super life affirming. It's with these fundamental principles of like life is suffering. While there might be truth there, it's just hard for me to accept that it's ultimate truth. If you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, that's what Vajrayana Tantric Buddhism says, that it exchanges dukkha for sukha. That is what you just called suffering. It says is converted to bliss. Sukha is bliss, but dukkha doesn't mean suffering exactly. It more literally means unsatisfactoriness. And I think that we can all agree that life is basically unsatisfactory. That's all that it's saying. It's not saying that everything is suffering, even, because you read this. This is the way it's often placed. Phrased like, oh, even pleasure is suffering because it eventually fades and you'll want it to carry on. Well, it only if you want it to carry on is it suffering, is it unpleasant or unsatisfactory. Just like the unpleasant things you don't want to start, the pleasant things you don't want to stop. Well, it's the wanting part, which is that's where the suffering comes from, where the unsatisfactoriness comes from. But it's not said to be the entirety of everything. It is merely the cause of suffering, that is desire and so on. But there are times in our life when we're not desiring anything, we're not dissatisfied, and it's yes, it can be definitely can be misconstrued as that means that I have to get rid of all desire in my life. It doesn't say that at all. It gives quite a different path in the Noble Eightfold Path. But yeah, like there's an Italian expression which is to translate is to betray. It's much easier, much better in Italian because the words sound very, very similar. But it's true. Every single translation that you make, you have to find an approximation in the target language.
Okay, well, that's really helpful.
And suffering was a very early attempt at translating dukkha, which doesn't really get to the essence.
Yeah, that's helpful. I just finished some sort of bad fiction about Wadsworth and a bunch of Harvard folks translating Dante. It was a terrible murder mystery, and that concept of translation making the essence difficult to convey was brought up regularly.
Ah, yes. Well, there was a murder mystery writer who was the world's expert on Dante. And I might have been Dorothy L. Sayers. I'm not sure, but somebody of that ilk, that period. And she actually did a translation of the Divine Comedy, but was much better known for her detective novels.
That's interesting. Cool. So we're a bunch over an hour, Mike, and I wanted to give you a chance to maybe talk about some of your upcoming stuff that people can keep an eye for. I'd love to keep chatting with you for hours, but, podcasts like to be short.
Yes, sure. I'm working on a Buddhist guide to psychedelics, a kind of user guide at the moment, which will give suggestions as to what practices, meditations, etc., you might try while you're on various psychedelics. It will suggest appropriate psychedelics for various practices, some anecdotes of my experiences with the various practices and drugs, and also there will be a quick guide with all of these things tabulated. That's one project I'm working on, and another one is my biography, which my publisher, Psychedelic Press, is urging me to complete. And at the same time, I'm working on a fantasy novel for teens. So I have to compete with my daughters, who are both writers, and my younger daughter is very successful with her books for younger children. And so if you have kids between like 9 and 12, I would recommend looking into the Scribble Witch stories. The second book is coming out next year. So that's my daughter, Kate Willis Crowley. And my elder daughter is also writing a book at the moment, but she won't let us know what it's about. So she's very smart and a very good writer, so I expect it'll sell.
Excellent. Well, Mike Crowley, thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope we get to reconnect once your next books are out.
Right, certainly, absolutely. I hope so too. So thanks a lot. That was a pleasure. Of course, I can natter on for hours on this subject. So it's been an absolute pleasure being allowed to do so without interruption.
It's just how interested I am. And there you have it, Mike Crowley. Thank you all for tuning in to Psychedelics Today. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to help us out, if you enjoyed what you heard, please tell a friend. If you're able to help financially, you can help us out at patreon.com/psychedelicstoday, leaving us a small monthly donation as small as $2 a month. Anything helps, so we really appreciate it. And again, in September, we're starting up Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. It's a great class where you can learn loads about psychedelics from a clinical perspective that is really broad ranging. It's not kind of, totally neuroscience focused, though we do touch that a bit. We are transpersonally oriented. So you get to talk about a lot of the complexities that come up here, and lots of great stuff in the class. And if you want to get an idea of what we cover, just come check out the website, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And the class is called Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. So I think that's it for now. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you on the Friday episode. Bye-bye.